What's up, guys? It's your boys Awoki back at it with a crime type video, and with Edward from Behind Criminal Minds coming back and giving us this video of Scott Peterson. I definitely am glad the man is back. He does a great job at his videos, and with Scott Peterson having huge similarities to Chris Watts, or I should say Chris Watts having a lot of similarities to Scott Peterson, I definitely want to look at this case because this man is trying to get free, which is ridiculous. Before we go any further, if you guys could do me a solid favor and subscribe to my YouTube channel by hitting that white bar icon down at the bottom right, hit that bell icon next to it, so when I do post videos like this one, you guys will get that little ring notification that Zwolki myself has posted that video, and then you guys can watch, comment, like, and share. And again, thank you so very much for the love and support. I can't thank you guys enough. Also, make sure you guys go over to Behind Criminal Minds. Go give him some love. The man is like chef kiss when it comes to crime videos and so forth. And you should watch his other stuff and so forth. With that being said, let's get into this. With this case being almost, 2 decades old, with him to walk free is ridiculous. So let's take a look.
Another twist tonight in Scott Peterson's push to prove his innocence. A judge now giving his team access to decades-old evidence they hope will lead to a new trial.
1 month ago, on October the 7th, a California Superior Court judge
he's right where he needs to be.
Granted Scott Peterson's legal petition for access to post-conviction discovery. It was Peterson's first notable legal victory by his new defense team, the Los Angeles Innocence Project. A win that some believe could open the door to Peterson being granted a new jury trial, allowing him to achieve his decades-long plan to walk free of the homicide of his pregnant wife, Laci Peterson.
Who else would have motive to get rid of her? The man had a mistress. The mistress didn't know about the wife. It's not like a Chris Watts when it comes to the mistress part, but it comes to a Chris Watts kind of familiarity because Scott murdered his wife to be with new mistress. Just saying.
In today's episode, I want to show you the new information that has come to light. Details never previously reported. Indisputable facts that anyone who advocates for truth and justice needs to hear.
That's why I like this guy.
The trial and subsequent conviction of Scott Peterson was a worldwide phenomenon that captured the airwaves of every television screen throughout the early 2000s. But in the years since Peterson's conviction, he has attempted to reframe the truth by slowly swaying prominent supporters and a growing segment of the public to his side. But how did any of this happen? How is it possible that a man for whom the public's belief in his guilt was all but certain? How has Scott Peterson succeeded in altering the narrative of his own case so that a road has now been paved towards his own freedom? Last year, I attempted to answer that question through my original detailed analysis of his case, looking behind the media narratives and pundits to understand how we arrived at a place where the truth can be whatever Scott Peterson wants it to be. But the new answers that I have found are something that I believe few understand about the true crime media landscape and the impact that it has had on the very foundations of our justice system today. In today's video, I will show you behind the curtain of a world that you were never meant to see. Exposing the power of misinformation, its pervasive hold on our media, and just how far it reaches into the justice system, and now into every corner of the media that we consume each and every day. And before we're done, I will show you just how far the ongoing campaign to promote misinformation has gone, reaching out to impact and alter the content of creators everywhere. A tacit requirement to sanitize the truth in exchange for exposure, money, and prestige, in exchange for one all-encompassing demand: your obedience. This is the high price of misinformation, the Scott Peterson case.
People versus Scott
7
Peterson.
years ago, on August the 15th of 2017, A&E released the first episode of the now infamous documentary series, The Murder of Laci Peterson.
Which I watched.
Prior to 2017, the claims of Scott Peterson's innocence had not been given clear and credible support within the media at large. But all of that would change when the worldwide behemoth A&E published a docuseries slanted entirely in Peterson's defense. This docuseries was the first crack in the dam, succeeding in swaying the opinions of many within the public. And in the years since the docuseries aired, Peterson has succeeded in retaining representation by the aforementioned Los Angeles Innocence Project, who just this year alone has filed various pleadings with the stated aim of helping Peterson to walk out of prison as a free man. In late 2022, I began researching the Peterson trial with the expressed purpose of methodically reviewing every claim made by his defense. From the onset, I was determined to check my bias at the door and remain objective despite the information that I already knew.
That's why I like
But in
this
order
guy.
to understand the trajectory of Scott Peterson's case present day, I want to briefly revisit the facts of what secured his conviction. And please understand that due to time constraints, the following is merely a brief compilation of the facts. This small segment of the evidence represents just some of the primary arguments that convicted Scott Peterson in a court of law by a jury of his peers. So as always, let's begin. Laci Peterson was reported missing on December 24th, 2002, and after months of searching and worldwide media attention, her remains would eventually be located on April the 13th, 2003. Confirming what law enforcement already suspected, that Laci Peterson and her unborn son Connor were the tragic victims of a brutal homicide. But it was the facts surrounding the case that ultimately secured a conviction against Scott Peterson at his trial, which included just some of the following.
The prosecution of
On
Scott
Christmas
Peterson.
Eve, December 24th, 2002, Scott Peterson returned home from fishing at the Berkeley Marina. Upon arriving home, he immediately noticed that his wife Laci, who was already 8 months pregnant, was nowhere to be found. In the days prior, Scott had told multiple people that he planned to go golfing that day, but would instead go on to claim that on the morning of Christmas Eve, he took an impromptu and unplanned trip to the Berkeley Marina over 80 miles away from their home in Modesto, California.
Shocking.
The exact same area where Laci's remains would be found. Evidence would later reveal that Scott's trip to the Berkeley Marina was not at all spontaneous, that in fact, Scott had purchased a fishing license on the 20th of December specifically for Christmas Eve on the 24th. This clearly established a premeditated plan to visit the marina on the same day that Laci would go missing. Scott would go on to tell law enforcement that upon arriving home, he noticed Laci's vehicle was still in the driveway, but that she was nowhere to be found. However, instead of attempting to call Laci on her cell phone, Scott chose to do a single load of laundry comprised of only the clothes he was wearing. Then he got into the shower and came out and ate pizza and milk, and that alone is damning enough. But only after removing any physical evidence off of his body did he then decide to call Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, not the police, to inform her that Laci was missing and gone. And in the hours after Laci was reported missing, while Scott was telling her friends, her family, and her loved ones that his wife simply disappeared, Scott never once attempted to call Laci's cell phone to see where she was. Because as the prosecution rightly asserted, Scott Peterson already knew that his wife was dead and gone. In the weeks prior to Laci's reported disappearance, Scott began a serious and intimate relationship with Amber Frey. But on December 9th, 15 days before Laci was ever reported missing, Scott tearfully admitted to Amber that he had been previously married. However, he stated
Previously,
that his wife was gone, implying that she was deceased and that this would be his first Christmas without her. Throughout the investigation, Scott declined to assist in finding Laci. He repeatedly refused to work with the media or even help with the multitude of people searching for her, all while continuing to lie to his mistress, law enforcement.
and yet there is a possibility this man could try to get out. Are you kidding?
And Laci's family about critical details from the day that Laci went missing. And just 6 hours after Laci was reported missing, before anyone had any reason to suspect that any harm had come to Laci, Scott asks the lead detective for details on contacting a grief counselor, the type of counselor that is normally used to help support victims' families after they have been notified of a death. In the days prior to his arrest, law enforcement believed Scott Peterson was in the process of fleeing the country after he was seen having drastically changed his appearance. A short time later, Scott was arrested by law enforcement and was found to be carrying large sums of cash, a go bag, a weapon, as well as an anchor that they believed Peterson had used to weigh down Laci's remains. But most shocking of all, law enforcement found a map in his car that led directly to Amber Frey's workplace. A map that they believed to be the final step in Scott's plan to prevent Amber from ever being able to testify against him.
He was going to murder her.
The evidence against Scott Peterson was so considerable that in order to believe he is innocent, you would have to willfully ignore the mountain of evidence that rightfully convicted him by a jury of his peers in a court of law. But after all this time, you might be surprised to learn that the documentary I produced last year about Scott Peterson's case was never really about the evidence against him. You see, all of the court records that I researched and presented have been available to the public since his trial ended.
20 years
The real
ago.
purpose of why I
22.
made that video was to show something that, frankly, in our time has become more and more difficult for people to see. When the truth is eroded, when misinformation transforms our certainty into disbelief, and when lies are compounded over time and allowed to be transmuted into reality. What I wanted more than anything else was to shine a spotlight on the egregiously effective misinformation campaign that was waged when A&E aired these episodes. So then how did they do it? How did the producers of this documentary succeed in altering the view of so many people who were previously certain of Peterson's guilt? I believe the answer to that question is more important than ever, because if we don't learn how to recognize when it's happening, it will keep happening. And the next time that someone tries to reframe what you know to be true, you might be the next one to fall for it.
Boy. Are you going to play? There we go.
One of the most effective tools of a concentrated disinformation campaign is the use of misleading information that slowly over time incrementally alters the pre-existing view of the audience.
If you know this case from watching television, probably almost everything you believe to be true about the case is not.
It's achieved by deploying misinformation that already closely aligns with your pre-existing worldviews, which inherently makes it more likely to succeed. When we hear the words mis or disinformation, we often associate that terminology with nefarious actors that are deployed by foreign countries during elections, or propaganda that is echoed by mass media, or even by entire governments. But driving down the road, listening to your favorite true crime podcast is the last place you would ever suspect to be the target of a disinformation campaign. And that's precisely why it's so effective.
There was no biological evidence, no forensic evidence whatsoever that pointed to the guilt of Scott Peterson.
The docuseries, The Murder of Laci Peterson, was featured on a network that has already established itself as a well-respected name in the true crime genre. It's a network known for some of the most esteemed and well-known shows that are still watched by
First 48.
millions today.
I watch
so
all
then
the time.
how does Scott Peterson, a man unanimously convicted of the first-degree murder of his pregnant wife Laci, end up with a documentary series that sole purpose appears to be to discredit the entirety of the case that convicted him?
The reason the police weren't able to find any evidence of a murder inside this house is because no murder occurred inside this house. The important house was this house. This house was being burglarized.
I needed to know the answer to that question. So I went looking to find out who was responsible for creating this series. And I'm willing to bet my oceanfront property in Arizona, you aren't going to like what I found. On July 20th, 2017, a local Modesto newspaper, the Modesto Bee, published an article entitled An Inside Look at the Making of the Peterson TV Series, airing in August 2017. Reporter for the Bee, Garth Stapley, spoke with the executive producers of the series, John Marks and Poe Cutchins. And on its face, the article was a fairly typical puff piece that local newspapers have been writing ad infinitum for decades. But in reading the article, a few things stood out to me in terms of the producers' clear intent for the series and what they hoped it would achieve. Reporter Stapley began the interview by asking the question, what makes The Murder of Laci Peterson different from all other documentaries covering this case? Executive producer John Marks replied by saying, quote, "We think it's unprecedented, the number of voices and the time we give it. Our series is profoundly ambitious, with enormous ramifications on how the media is viewed and how the criminal justice system operates." Okay, now listen to what he says next. Quote, "It's a great American epic that tells us something about ourselves," unquote. Wow, a great American epic?
So I'm guessing it probably comes down to money.
Sorry, but are we talking about the same documentary, Mr. Marks? Is that documentary in the room with us? Because if this series is the litmus test for what constitutes a great American epic, we are in a lot of trouble. Because it should concern everyone that no one from Laci Peterson's family or from the prosecution was involved at all in the filming of this great epic. But immediately after that question, the reporter asked the producer why they interviewed so many people for the docuseries.
But not the
please,
family?
Do me a huge favor. For the next minute or so, try not to fall asleep. Okay. Quote, "All of a sudden, the whole story begins to open up, and you see a larger picture of how it all evolved, how notions were formed from specific incidents and moments. It opens up territories of feeling and fact, and that's really valuable to grasping how we came to view this case and how the people shaping the case came to the conclusions they felt were worth reporting. Boring. Details tell the story, recollected in hindsight as they were unfolding at the moment. With enough dust settled and with the habeas appeal underway, there is a chance to say, was all of this in the picture?" Okay, come back. And please listen very closely to the next words he says.
Okay.
"And we can tell the story in a way that is calm, collected, and methodical that would not have been possible during the unfolding drama," unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, everything you just heard is the legal definition of a corporate nonsense answer that represents everything I abhor about this industry. Because it's his answer that tells you everything you need to know about why this documentary was greenlit and why it found a home on the A&E network. It tells you how they got away with masking their true intentions of being a mouthpiece for Scott's defense while claiming to be a present and calm, rational view of an irrational conviction.
So it sounds like they were pretty much biased, is what I'm hearing. I'm not saying that's what it is. It sounds like they were biased towards Scott Peterson. I could be wrong, but what do you think?
See, this executive producer has essentially just said that because they talked to so many people so many years after the fact, totally disconnected from the emotion of Laci and Connor's homicide, that this is essentially the first time anyone has objectively reviewed the facts of Scott Peterson's case. Even going so far as to say that with Scott Peterson's current appeal underway, they can ask the question, did all of this important, undiscovered evidence get weighed properly by the jury? You see, this executive producer is not even pretending to want to be objective. He's already laying the foundation for why he believes the media fed the irrational hysteria against Scott, which was ultimately responsible for his arrest and his conviction. These producers are beginning with a clear...
I'm pretty sure he put himself there because he did the crime. So he's doing the time. I can't believe this is a possibility.
Clear and unambiguous motive to alter the view of how you see this case, while knowing full well that the prosecutors, Laci's family, and the full weight of the evidence against Scott will conveniently be absent from this great American epic. But I'll concede that not everyone may be fully convinced that the producers of this series had a clear motive in establishing the innocence of Scott Peterson. So, let's keep reading. Okay. Later in the article, the reporter asks the producer, how would you respond to people who have no interest in hearing from Scott Peterson? Quote, we understand the significance people place on this case. Some people are not going to want to hear from him or anything that breaks from the official narrative. And listen to this, quote, all we can do is say, hey, this is the case in all of its scope. If you've seen my first video on Scott Peterson, or frankly any documentary concerning his case, then you already know just how incredibly absurd that statement is.
Yes.
Even the suggestion that this series represented the evidence both for and against the innocence of Scott Peterson is completely ludicrous. That any of what is provided in this series could even meet the legal requirement of being considered evidence sufficient enough to have in any way influenced the outcome of Scott Peterson's trial. And yet these producers seem to want to ignore the journalistic responsibility they had on their shoulders while making absurd claims of objectivity, especially when you hear what the producers say next. The reporter proceeds to ask them how they decided on the title of the series, The Murder of Laci Peterson. Their Cliff Notes answer was to say that they wanted to convey a new look and a new set of facts. So the reporter asked the logical follow-up question. So the name of the series wasn't to honor the victim, Laci Peterson? The executive producer responded by saying, quote, we all feel, and it only grew over time, that Laci was kind of missing in this story. We attempt to honor that throughout the series, trying to get as much in as we could about her.
But you didn't include Laci's family.
Unquote. Oh, how nice. Because somehow in your mind, honoring Laci Peterson in her memory is achieved by platforming unfounded conspiracy theories with zero evidentiary value, which now opens the door for setting the man who was convicted of her homicide free from prison. All while giving credibility to misinformation that advocates for the person legally responsible for the death of her and her unborn son. But don't worry, it's fine because they tell nice stories about Laci and Scott and show pictures and tell heartwarming tales of who Laci was. And somehow in the world they occupy, as long as they do that while helping to exonerate her murderer, that honors Laci. Listen, I'm going to be honest. This is where I got stuck for a long time. Because this is the part of the script where I'm supposed to eloquently pivot to the next part of the story. But in so many past iterations of this, I outlined how we can identify misinformation and the ways that it impacts our daily lives. But it occurred to me in the numerous times that I wrote and rewrote the script that what I saw behind all of this was something that so many of you are starting to see. That truth itself is under attack. That the very nature of what we know to be true has been whittled away piece by piece, justice being erased.
Popularity and money buys. I'm telling you that right now. It's pretty much what I saying every single time with the Chris Watts case, money and popularity pays. And unfortunately, the truth is getting thrown underneath the rug
by those who have the financial means and resources to alter that truth in their favor. Those with power and influence who rewrite history while claiming to advocate for the very victims whose lives they destroyed. You see, my video was never about the evidence against Scott Peterson. 20 years ago, a jury spent months listening to that evidence and came to the right conclusion.
It's about how to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And again, and again, and again. That's why we do these kind of videos.
Just like everyone else who has ever taken the time to really pay attention to it. Because behind all of the obfuscation, all of the lies, all of the attempts by Scott at telling the world that something what they know is wrong is actually right, he forgot something along the way. Something that all the money in the world will never succeed in altering, will never succeed in changing no matter how much he wants it to. It's something that no amount of time can or will ever amend. The one true thing that honors the life and memory of Laci and her son Connor more than anything else ever could, more than anything else ever will. The truth.
Amplify conspiracy.
There is a term that is used in extreme examples of overt mistakes that are made by members of the media. It's often referred to as journalistic malpractice. It's not a legal term per se, it's more of an indictment of someone who has sidestepped the responsibilities of a journalist to adequately vet the information they are presenting. My first video of Scott Peterson's case was presented as an impeachment of the entirety of the A&E series, The Murder of Laci Peterson, what I see as the definition of journalistic malpractice. It was my intent to clearly and objectively demonstrate the unambiguous evidence that the entirety of the claims made in defense of Scott Peterson do not outweigh the considerable evidence in support of his guilt. However, for the sake of those who may not have watched the original video in its entirety, let's briefly revisit the scene.
Oh boy. I can tell you right now, the stuff that I've watched over time with this case, the evidence is so heavy on Scott Peterson that I don't see how this man could ever see the light of freedom again. But like he said, there are people that are taking conspiracies and twisting them into truth and then trying to make it so that he can get out? Really?
24/7 news is entertainment. Like any good entertainment, there's a formula for winning over the audience. Find a defendant who's enviable. And probably most importantly, are they attractive? Or is the victim attractive? And, that's Scott Peterson and Laci Peterson.
From the very beginning of the first episode of the series, the producers set the stage for a clear prosecution of the media. They lay the foundation for the inference that the only reason why Scott Peterson was convicted was because of the massive media frenzy that inspired a bloodlust for his guilt, allowing for a purely circumstantial case to invert justice against Scott as guilty until proven innocent. But throughout each episode of the series, the primary evidence presented at trial against Peterson is not given the same weight, time, or objectivity. In fact, the entire series appears to be a well-orchestrated effort to dismantle the facts that secured his conviction. Each episode of the series conveniently mirrors Scott Peterson's entire legal defense, echoing virtually every claim found within Scott's appellate briefs. In fact, one of the primary arguments made to the court on behalf of Scott Peterson and his defense team was that the media unfairly biased the jury and therefore convicted Scott. But
Are
in
you
what
kidding
universe can a documentary claim any form of journalistic integrity or objectivity when the foundation it has been created upon is the legal defense of an adjudicated murderer for which no forensic evidence exists in support of his claims. Because whether they like it or not, the media did not convict Scott Peterson. The evidence did.
The jury of his peers looked at the evidence
We really
and
thought that the
convicted him.
police were putting due diligence into following up on any tips that were coming in, but unfortunately we found out later they were not.
Throughout each episode of the series, multiple members of Scott Peterson's family and defense team, both past and present, make the claim that Scott was honest and forthright from the very beginning, that he was an altruistic husband who told the truth, assisted law enforcement, and did whatever he could to help locate Laci. Of course, they handwave all of the factual evidence that completely contradicts those claims from the fact that at his own jury
Right there, look at it right there. Scott Peterson told his lover on December 9th that he had lost his wife and that he was not having an affair at the time of his pregnancy disappearance. It sounds like something else.
contradicts those claims from the fact that at his own jury trial, the prosecution proved time and time again that he lied to everyone all the time, from Laci's family, the police, and even his own mistress. And the claim that Modesto police were single-minded in their focus of Scott totally ignores the evidence that points towards Scott from the moment they walked through the door. It completely ignores the evidence that law enforcement continued to run down hundreds of thousands of leads,
10,000?
even opening a detailed investigation into the thefts that occurred next door. In fact, I'm shocked that law enforcement didn't arrest Scott Peterson earlier, and frankly, within days of Laci being reported missing, precisely because of the clear indication that he was intentionally misleading investigators, hiding and
throw him
destroying
off.
evidence, and I don't know, doing things like selling his missing wife's only vehicle, her only source of transportation. It's almost as though Scott knew that she wasn't coming home and that Laci would never.
Like Chris Watts. And I know you guys are going to be like, will you stop comparing the cases? They're so familiar. They're so identical almost. It's just with a couple of differences here and there. But Chris did the same thing. He canceled the girls' school. He talked to the realtor about selling the house. He canceled the paper. I mean, and you're telling me that they're trying to get this man out because of conspiracies?
Needed again. And it would explain why he purchased adult TV channels in their living room, something all of Laci's family and friends knew she would never condone, because once again, Scott
He knew
Peterson
she wasn't coming
knew
back.
that his wife, Laci, was never coming home.
Was Scott fishing by himself, or was he with someone in Berkeley?
We're not gonna discuss that at this point.
Probably viewers would find it odd that you can't explain what the husband was doing fishing.
Well, let me kind of just put that all to rest. It would be wrong for me to speculate.
But instead of rushing to judgment, the Modesto police waited to build their case, focused on obtaining evidence, and properly investigated all persons of interest in this case. And do you think any of those facts made it into this Oscar award-winning example of a documentary? Yep. I'm willing to bet you already know the answer to that question.
No.
And then these witnesses that see her walking the dog plot out in a perfect circle about a 45-minute walk, which is normally what she took.
This was one of the primary linchpins of Scott Peterson's defense, specifically the claim that after he left to go fishing, nearly a dozen people saw Laci walking their dog around their neighborhood. The docuseries sets the hook by making you believe that 11 different people saw Laci. Therefore, that many people couldn't possibly be wrong. That's not just improbable, it's impossible. And if they saw Laci after Scott left to go fishing, then that would mean Scott Peterson is innocent, right? Well,
Yeah.
Conveniently, they forget to mention that missing posters of Laci were placed all around that area in the days following December 24th. And on that missing poster, it describes what Laci was wearing: a white long-sleeve shirt and black pants. And wouldn't you know it, that just so happens to be exactly what the 11 independent witnesses remembered Laci was wearing when they saw her walking the dog that day. But there's just one major problem with that. You see, when Laci's remains were found, she was wearing entirely different clothes. And that's why no one from Scott Peterson's defense team ever brought a single one of those supposedly credible witnesses in front of the jury during Scott's trial, because they knew that their inaccurate statements would be impeached on cross-examination and would only further undermine his claims of innocence. But they don't have to mention any of that in their epic documentary, because it seems to me that the truth wasn't the point. The point was to give Scott and Janie Peterson and anyone else who has been beating the drum of his innocence exactly what they've wanted since day one. A documentary that gave the claims of Scott Peterson's innocence the veneer of legitimacy. And so far, it's working.
I never wavered from my belief that he didn't have anything to do with Laci.
He was absolutely the most hated man in Modesto, but there was nothing about Amber Frey that tied him to his wife's disappearance.
Throughout the series...
What? Like, they're saying that, oh, Laci wasn't, or Miss Amber wasn't the reason? He wanted to start a new life. Hello? He wanted to get rid of the old life. Be with Amber. Again, I'm not blaming Amber because that woman was not in coherence. No, that's not it. She was not in connection with everything, because back then social media didn't exist. Like, it wasn't Facebook. It wasn't like, it was MySpace, but it wasn't like what we have today.
Multiple Peterson surrogates toe the family line that Amber Frey was nothing more than a meaningless mistake that did not shed light on Scott's character and had nothing to do with Laci's disappearance. And this was when I knew the A&E docuseries was not interested in presenting an accurate representation of the facts, because it was Amber's brave assistance with law enforcement and her testimony that helped to reveal one of the smoking guns that helped to convict Scott Peterson. On December 8th, nearly 3 weeks before Laci was ever reported missing, Scott's web of lies came crashing down. A close friend of Amber's confronted Scott and demanded that he tell Amber the truth about being married, or else she would. The next day, on the 9th of December, Scott met with Amber at her house and was completely hysterical. With tears running down his face, unable to maintain his composure, he confessed to Amber that he had been lying to her, that he was in fact previously married. Scott told Amber Frey 15 days before Laci Peterson's homicide that Laci was already dead and gone, and that this would be his first Christmas without her. But it was what Scott did later that absolutely convinced me of his guilt. On the day that Scott believed he might lose Amber due to the lies that he had been telling her, he confessed a version of the truth. And on that exact same day, he purchased the boat that prosecutors believed he used to dispose of the remains of his wife and child. And just hours earlier, he searched the tidal patterns of the Berkeley Marina, the exact same place where Laci's remains were found, and on the same boat where law enforcement located a pair of pliers that had a strand of Laci's hair stuck inside. So once again, do you think any of that damning information made it into the A&E documentary? You already know the answer.
When the man convicted of this burglary, Stephen Todd, was interviewed by the detective, first words out of his mouth, "I had nothing to do with a pregnant girl."
One of the most significant claims made by the A&E series in defense of Peterson's innocence was that a robbery took place near the Peterson home around the time that Laci went missing. The series plants the seed that Laci was a Spitfire who very well could have confronted these criminals whose homicidal guilt is implied without the burden of actual evidence.
But what would have been their motive? Oh, because it was a burglary gone wrong and a murder happened. I highly doubt that. But the evidence again towards Scott, he purchased the boat. There's her hair on the boat of Laci's, and Laci was missing. Like, come on. The truth always gets manipulated so much.
Evidence that they assert could have easily been obtained by law enforcement who was already blind in their focus of Scott, and in so doing, their prejudice allowed them to miss the real culprits of the crime. Over the years, we have been witness to cases where law enforcement does in fact make egregious mistakes, and it's because of that claim of a wrongful prosecution that it preys on our pre-existing empathy.
I didn't say that out loud, did I?
On the very recent distrust of many within the public and the tenuous relationship with our elected officials. It gives us permission to completely ignore all of the evidence that we already know for the improbable and the illogical, all while conveniently leaving out the fact that Scott Peterson's $1 million defense attorney never once brought any credible evidence in support of the claim that thieves next door were somehow responsible for Laci's death. Because let's think about this for a moment. The Petersons have millions of dollars, access to the best lawyers, investigators, and analysts in the world, and yet somehow we are expected to pardon Scott on the basis that law enforcement didn't fully traverse an unfounded rabbit hole because they would like for us to ignore the means, motive, and opportunity that rightfully convicted Scott in exchange for thieves who they claim not only executed a pregnant stranger and had the wherewithal to place her in the exact same area
that Scott
Peterson went fishing. Apparently, these men aren't thieves at all. They are diabolical criminal masterminds. But here's a little something called evidence that all of the documentaries carrying water for Scott Peterson have conveniently failed to mention. That on June 18th of 2019, Judge Thomas Zeff granted an order submitted by Scott Peterson's defense team for DNA testing. Okay. Scott's attorneys petitioned the court to test blood evidence found in a stolen orange van that they claim was related to the thieves who are inferred to be the true cause of Laci Peterson's homicide. And what do you think the results found? Do I even need to tell you that they didn't return back with female DNA, but in fact male DNA, once again pointing guilt back into Scott's direction where it belongs? You see, a well-orchestrated misinformation campaign is never actually about the truth. It's about altering your perception of the truth. It's about convincing you that maybe what you thought you knew isn't as concrete as you remember. Throughout the series, each episode points the blame for our passionate belief in his guilt as nothing more than the fault of a rabid 24/7 news cycle, all while at the same time totally ignoring that the public's righteous anger with Scott Peterson was because of Scott Peterson. It was because of his actions, and even more importantly, his inaction. His affair was just confirmation of what people already suspected. And the evidence presented by the prosecution in support of the crimes that he perpetrated was nothing more than the execution of justice for Laci and for Connor. But it's what I'm about to show you next that will help you to understand just how effective well-placed misinformation can be.
Exploit information.
On August 20th of this year, the Peacock streaming platform released a 3-part series called Face to Face with Scott Peterson. Once again, the exact same producers of the A&E series found a new home for their many claims of Scott Peterson's innocence. And to absolutely no one's surprise, the series is rife with unfounded defense claims that once again attempt to reframe the truth of Scott Peterson's conviction. However, no concrete evidence or factual information is presented in this or any other series that in any way supports the myriad of lies that Scott Peterson has told since Christmas Eve 2002. Since the Los Angeles Innocence Project began the representation of Peterson in January of this year, they have succeeded in continuing to use the same media that they blame for his conviction to help spread misinformation in support of his purported innocence.
No murder weapon was found. No time or even date of death was established. No cause and manner of death were ever established.
Misinformation is just a word that we use to describe a lie, verbiage that we've accepted into the lexicon of available synonyms. But the reality is, the impact of misinformation is all around us. Far too often, we assume that because the person we are listening to sounds credible, or because they are intelligent and well-spoken, and their perspective fits our pre-existing worldview, that somehow they are any less deserving of our careful scrutiny. Many times we let our guard down, and we assume that because we enjoy the content originating from that creator, or because they have a pleasant voice, or even because they sound well-intentioned, that we are not at risk. We make positive assumptions about information that we're told because we believe that person to be trustworthy, leaving no room for further analysis. And I want to prove to you right now that even you are susceptible to misinformation. What if I told you that already in this video you have heard patently false information? Would you know exactly what it is?
Probably not.
Now, before we go any further, I want you to be honest. Write it down, what specifically the misinformation was, and provide any available sources that you have. And the first person to get it right, I'll pin your comment and send you my email because I need your analytical mind on my team. But I digress. Okay, so I'm going to assume that you wrote it down. So let's go back and listen to this part of the video again. A short time later, Scott was arrested by law enforcement and was found to be carrying large sums of cash, a go bag, a weapon, as well as an anchor that they believed Peterson had used to weigh down Laci's remains. Did you get it that time? Now, I would venture a guess that a large enough percentage of people in the general public don't know exactly what was found in Scott Peterson's vehicle on the day that he was arrested. But it is likely that if you followed his case at all, then you probably heard about the prosecution's claim that Scott Peterson made an extra anchor to help hide the remains in the bay. And that's the thing with misinformation. It so often retains elements of the truth while appearing to innocently point you in the direction of a complete lie. You see, law enforcement never found the anchor that they believed Scott Peterson made and then threw into the Berkeley Marina. But if I didn't tell you that right now, would you have known? Because so many of us listen to true crime cases and often do not have a mastery knowledge of the case we are listening to prior to binging through each and every available episode. We assume that the person presenting the case to us has properly and thoroughly researched the evidence. But just think about the power of someone making small and intentional alterations or omissions of the facts. When viewed in the expanse of a single episode of a documentary series, it can seem insignificant. However, compounded over time, directed misinformation has the power to sway entire segments of the public into the wrongful belief that a lie is actually the truth.
Scott Peterson is innocent. And I changed my mind on this when I watched The Murder of Laci Peterson. A&E did it back in 2017. And I went into that like, this guy is totally guilty. I remember my husband, he didn't know much about the case, so we were like, let's watch it together. And by the end of it, I was like, no, like, he's guilty of being a terrible husband. He's guilty of cheating. He did not murder her. And, you know, the Innocence Project picked up, I hear a lot of people on TikTok talking about that this week, that the Innocence Project is taking on his case. And of course, everyone is up in arms about it. Guys, I'm telling you, go watch that documentary. It's streaming on Hulu right now.
And as you can see, without the truth, how can you even know if someone is trying to convince you of the emperor's new clothes? Since beginning this channel, I set out to create accurate and factual content that is journalistically honest and forthcoming.
That's why I like
It's
this guy.
no secret that I am direct and opinionated about the facts that I present, but it's why I show receipts and evidence throughout the video. It's why I take as long as I need to get it right, even at the expense and growth of this channel, and sometimes even my own sanity. But I know that I'm not alone when I say that it is so important that no matter what the popular view of a case is, the facts are what matters most.
Agreed.
Working hard to prevent misinformation and avoiding entirely one-sided narratives is not always easy. In fact, when I posted the Scott Peterson video last year, I could not have known the initial overwhelmingly negative reaction I would receive from hundreds of people. In the entirety of the video, I never once state or imply that I in any way believed the claims of Scott Peterson's innocence. I did, however, say that I would objectively review his defense evidence presented in the A&E series. Nothing more, nothing less. But as you can see, the reactions I received were less than charitable. In fact, I had to pin this to the top of the comment section to explain to the hundreds of angry people that this video was merely a neutral analysis of the claims of his defense. And yet, that did little to nothing to stop people from continuing to leave angry comments raging at me for even making the suggestion of objectivity in my analysis. That should concern everyone. But it's what happened a few months after I posted the Scott Peterson video that forced me to make a life-changing decision, an opportunity that had the potential to radically change the course of my life, an offer that would test my resolve to the truth, to combating misinformation, and would force me to answer the question, how much is my integrity worth?
Speak no evil.
My analysis of the Scott Peterson A&E series was a heartfelt attempt at demonstrating the importance of truth and just how easily that truth can be altered by a single documentary that presents misinformation in a way that appears unbiased. When I first posted the video here on YouTube, initially it didn't perform well. Hundreds of those angry people were refusing to watch it because they still believed I had made a video supporting Scott. Thankfully, enough people gave me the benefit of the doubt, and one night out of the blue, YouTube decided that my video was performing well enough to be shown to a wider audience. Within hours, it began getting thousands of views, and by the next day, I couldn't believe it, but it had surpassed 250,000. Each morning, I would wake up and stare at the analytics in amazement that all of that hard work was seemingly paying off. I began receiving comments from people who told me they understood my approach, even hearing from those who admitted that they had been duped by the series, explaining that they too were taken in by the many claims of Scott's innocence. It was just a few months later, and I found myself completely neck deep in the Chris Watts series.
Amen, brother.
I was up late summarizing hundreds of pages of his discovery, and just before I was getting ready to finish, I received a very unexpected email. The message was from an executive representing one of the largest true crime media empires in the world, and he was asking if I was available to speak. A short time later, we got on the phone and he began to explain the reason for his inquiry. He was the representative of an organization that has worldwide brand recognition, a media behemoth with tens of millions of viewers, an organization that is easily one of the most well-recognized names in true crime media on any social media platform today. It would be something of an understatement to say that I was intimidated. And during the call, he explained that his company was interested in forming a partnership with me. I almost couldn't believe what he was saying. Partnering with me meant immediate worldwide exposure of all my content, the opportunity to have my channel placed on a major streaming service, and a revenue-sharing program that they were offering that would have meant life-changing money for me. After weeks of back-and-forth discussions, agreements were made and signed, and the only thing left to do was for them to decide which of my videos they wanted to publish first. Now, you probably already know that they chose the Scott Peterson series, which honestly made perfect sense because by that time, it was nearing 1.5 million views and the analytic performance numbers were, frankly, excellent. So I was asked to upload the master copy of the video to their server, and I did. I can't begin to tell you how excited I was for this opportunity. I was just minutes away from everything I honestly have ever wanted. Since I was a child, I've dreamt of being a filmmaker or writing a book or producing documentaries, and surely this had to be the opportunity that opened that door. I mean, right? A day later, I received an email from my contact with the company, and he asked if we could get on another conference call to discuss the video. Now, I'll be honest, as soon as I got that email, I was immediately panicked and nervous. I mean, after all, I made the video on CapCut on my iPhone 11.
Wow.
So I was fully expecting to hear that the quality of the video wasn't good enough and that I was going to need to send it to an editor to improve it somehow or something along those lines. But as soon as I got on the call, I was pleasantly surprised to hear that they only needed me to make some minor, easy-to-do changes. We continued to talk for a short time, and just when I thought the call was about to end, the executive segued into a discussion about the importance of a different pre-existing relationship that predated my involvement. At first, I was confused, but the longer that this went on, I began to realize that I already knew what he was about to say, because I had spent my entire life working in corporate America, and I already knew where this was going. You see, Edward, our organization has previously worked with A&E, and it's because of that history that we don't want to publish anything that might negatively impact that relationship or any future projects that we might work on. You understand?
Comes down to money.
I understand. I hung up the phone, but I knew they needed me to remove anything in the Scott Peterson video that in any way spoke poorly of the A&E network. Now, you might actually find this hard to believe, but I am not a confrontational person. Yes, I'm passionate and even bold when I need to be, but I knew before I hung up that phone exactly what I was going to do. When the call ended, I remember I just sat there and stared at my computer in complete disbelief. For most of my life, I have been successful in business. I was always someone who exceeded expectations, a hard worker, a team player, someone who understood the politics that is at the center of virtually every corporate entity today. Somewhere deep down, I knew that I could send my video to an editor who could remove all traces of my reasonable critiques of the A&E network and offer up a sanitized version of my own video. I knew that I could come to you, the audience, and explain that I had to make changes in order to make it palatable for a wider audience. I knew that all I needed to do was one last step, and then I could just sit back while they printed money. But even as I considered that option, it immediately occurred to me that I would be no different than the producers who gave that puff piece to the Modesto Bee, slowly trimming away the truth until all that's left are perfectly bland and digestible segments that are easily monetizable and ready for mass consumption. Truthfully, I knew from the moment I got off the phone that there was no possible way I could alter the video sufficiently enough to change the narrative that is the very thesis of the entire video. The whole point was that the A&E network platformed unsupported misinformation without reasonable evidence or a sufficient factual basis so as to be considered as tangible proof in any legal proceeding, let alone in a documentary series seeking to exonerate a convicted murderer that was criminally responsible for Laci Peterson's homicide. And there was no way that I was going to gut and disinfect that video in an effort to avoid stating unpleasantries that were not palatable to the network that was the object of my scrutiny. Listen, it's probably obvious by now, but I have always been the black sheep, and frankly, it's why I started this channel in the first place.
He does
I
such a good
wanted
job.
to do something different. I wanted to prove that true crime media can exist in this way, by speaking about these cases transparently and without sacrificing the victim's memory in the process. But I want to be clear, my refusal to participate in stripping my own content for money and a larger audience, that doesn't make me special, and that's not why I'm sharing this story with you. Because these videos aren't only about A&E or Scott Peterson's feckless attempts at trying to convince you that his lies are in fact the truth. This video is a reminder of what was lost, of the life that was stolen, and why Laci and her son Connor deserve to rest. But if I had to provide just one answer why I chose to walk away from that contract, my answer would be very simple.
For Laci, and that's what it is. It's always for
The A&E docuseries is merely a symptom of a much larger metastatic disease that has begun to infect every corner of the true crime media landscape today. My choice to not sterilize my own content is merely an indicator of what kind of content is allowed to exist on major media networks, and for the most part, it's superbly edited variations of the exact same thing. However, in recent years, the true crime genre has started to break out of the mold of network executives gatekeeping the airwaves, now finding a place throughout social media where we decide what succeeds and what does not. It bestows a distinct responsibility that forces us to ask important questions, a question that I ask of myself before I ever publish a single word. Does this advocate for and honor the memory of the victims, their families, and those they left behind? The name of this channel is Behind Criminal Minds, but you might be surprised to learn that the name
grab your heartstrings. There are channels that will bash the victim over and over and over, which they think that will sell.
Your mom did, didn't she? All like this?
Edward, you did a good job again. I'm guessing you probably don't watch my reactions towards your videos or my commentating, which is very minimal, but I definitely loved how he put this together, because obviously there are channels, there are companies that will be more biased towards the murderer, the suspect, as you will, because it's going to pay better. It's going to make more money if you sit there and support the suspect instead of actually going for the justice of this case, because no one wants, like I've heard before, news broadcastings and stuff like that. They're not going to sell on good cutesy bunnies and cutesy stuff. It's going to be paid for by lust, blood, violence, and unfortunately that's what they are going to continue doing to make more money. And I commemorate Edward for making this video to not let his guard down and keep the truth going, because these victims deserve to be how do I want to say it? The victims deserve the peace, their legacy not to be tainted and stuff like that. When it comes to Gabby Petito or Madeline Soto or Laci Peterson or Shanann Watts, these people are victims from their murders, but yet the murder is the one that's being talked about and sugar-coated, and like, what are we doing? Like myself and Edward and the good YouTubers that are out there, we are trying to bring these cases or keep the cases for justice, not to be conspiracy or how I want to say it, not to be thrown all these different conspiracies. Yes, I could be wrong myself for showing some conspiracies, but I put them out there for us to debate about if it's factual or not. But like like Edward said, we do these videos for the people that have lost their lives. And I will continue doing that with Chris Watts' case, other cases that might arise in the future, because upsettingly, there will be more, because people don't know how to act without murder. They think that murder is the option. They think murder is going to solve it. And that's not the answer. And that's what I'm hoping, that sometimes these videos will show that you can get away. You can leave the bad situation. And I'm hoping, there are people that have come to me that said that they left a bad situation and that they feel like they're on the trajectory of being their normal selves. And I just want people to survive, to not be murdered or taken away from this earth too soon because some idiot decided that he wanted a different life or she wanted to be better than the person that she was with. It just, I want justice. I want peace. And again, I'm not trying to sound like a broken record or a person that's from like a pageant that the girl just wants world peace. But it's just like the war that's happening right now with Ukraine and Russia. It's just, I want that to be done and over with. I want people to stop dying. Unfortunately, there are people that will be perished, but it's in medical reasons or old age, or I just don't want it to be murder anymore. You know, I don't want somebody to get their head bashed in, or somebody's been their head removed. Like, I'm just trying to find the words here. I'm just trying to say is that these videos that I do, the commentary, I do my own videos. So for the people that are like, oh, you're just reusing, I'm adding my 2 cents, and I'm also making my own videos. If you would watch all my own videos as well. With that being said, if you watched the Laci Peterson, the murder of Laci Peterson on A&E, let me know your thoughts. Let me know your thoughts on this video. Let me know your thoughts in general. I would surely love to hear what you guys and your opinions are as well. We can debate without being pissy. We can debate without being nasty. We can just be humans and talk and communicate amongst each other. Again, I thank you guys for watching my videos. Make sure you guys go over to Edward on Behind Criminal Minds. Give him some love by subscribing, commenting, liking, and sharing. You know the deal. And then on mine, please, again, thank you for subscribing, commenting, liking, and sharing. And if you are on the edge, all I can say is it's free. Please take care. Be safe. As always, keep nerding on. And we will see you guys in the next video. Peace.